Imagine waking up one day to find a letter in your mailbox. A letter accusing you of breaking the rules of your own neighborhood. No proof, no explanation, just a fine. What would you do? Pay quietly, or fight back? This is the story of how one homeowner stood up against an entire HOA board, demanded the truth, and uncovered a system built on fear and silence. What happened next shook the entire community. When David and his wife first moved into Willow Creek, the quiet suburban neighborhood seemed like a dream. The streets curved gently around rows of tidy, well-kept houses, and every morning sunlight spilled across the manicured lawns. It felt safe, predictable, and exactly the kind of place where people imagined raising children, sharing backyard barbecues, and living without unnecessary drama. Willow Creek wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a community overseen by a homeowners association, or HOA. David had never lived in a place with an HOA before, but when he signed the papers for his home, the idea didn't bother him. The board promised fairness, order, and standards that would protect property values. To him, it sounded like an extra layer of stability. He even remembered laughing when the realtor said, "Some people don't like HOAs, but ours is reasonable." David had believed it. For months, life unfolded exactly as he hoped. He planted flowers along the front walkway, carefully trimming them so they wouldn't grow unruly. His wife painted the front door a cheerful shade of blue, adding a welcoming touch on weekends. They hosted neighbors for coffee or wine, slowly weaving themselves into the fabric of the community. If the HOA sent any notices, they were simple reminders, trash bins tucked away on collection day, or seasonal decoration guidelines. Nothing that disrupted the peace. But beneath that calm surface, something invisible brewed. The HOA board met monthly, though David rarely attended. The meetings were posted on flyers or slipped into mailboxes, but they always seemed mundane. Discussions about landscaping contracts, snow removal schedules, and neighborhood watch updates. David trusted the board to handle these things. After all, they were neighbors too, volunteering their time. It never crossed his mind to question their judgment or authority. That trust, though, was fragile, and as it would turn out, it was about to be tested in a way he could never have imagined. One Tuesday afternoon, David was sitting on his porch with a cup of tea, enjoying the hum of cicadas in the warm air. The mail carrier dropped a stack of envelopes into his box. Bills, junk mail, and in the middle a crisp white envelope stamped with the HOAS emblem. He thought nothing of it. Maybe another reminder about lawn care, he figured. He tore it open casually. Inside was a letter that made his stomach tighten. It claimed he was in violation of the community's rules. The letter did not read like the friendly reminders he'd seen before. It was stern, almost cold. It accused him of breaking a regulation and informed him that he would be fined if the issue wasn't corrected. No photographs, no details, just a statement of guilt and a deadline. David blinked at the page, rereading it, searching for what exactly he had done wrong. The language was vague. Violation of community standards as outlined in the governing documents. But which standard, what section, what action? Confused, he called his wife over. She read the letter, frowning. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "What violation? We've followed everything," they asked. David felt the first prick of unease. He had trusted the HOA because he believed it acted fairly, but here was a notice of punishment without explanation. It felt less like governance and more like accusation. That night, he lay awake thinking about it. He wondered if maybe he'd overlooked something. Perhaps the flowers he planted were too close to the sidewalk, or the blue door had crossed some invisible line in the association's standards. But if there was a rule, shouldn't they tell him exactly which one? Shouldn't they provide evidence? For the first time since moving to Willow Creek, David felt like an outsider in his own home. The house he had worked so hard to buy, the sanctuary he and his wife cherished, suddenly seemed threatened by a faceless authority he didn't understand. The next morning, he pulled out the binder of HOA documents they had received when they moved in. It was thick, full of bylaws, declarations, and amendments. Flipping through, David realized just how dense and complicated it all was. There were rules about everything: landscaping, paint colors, mailbox design, even how long holiday decorations could stay up. But still, nothing explained why he had received that violation letter. As the days passed, his unease turned into something heavier. Every time he saw a neighbor, he wondered if they were the ones who had complained. Every time he saw the HOA president walking down the street, clipboard in hand, he felt a pang of suspicion. The neighborhood no longer felt so warm. What David didn't realize then was that this single letter, the vague accusation, the lack of proof, was just the beginning. What started as confusion would spiral into a battle over fairness, responsibility, and the meaning of community. The calm was over. The storm was coming. The letter sat on the kitchen counter like a silent intruder, its sharp words echoing in David's head long after he'd read them. Each time he walked by, his eyes landed on the phrase, "violation of community standards," and his chest tightened. It wasn't just the notice itself that unsettled him, it was the mystery of it. How could he defend himself if he didn't even know what he'd done wrong? On the third day after receiving it, David decided to call the HOA office. The number listed on the letter connected him to the community manager, a woman named Karen, who sounded brisk, almost impatient, as if she fielded dozens of these calls every week. "I'm calling about a violation notice I received," David explained carefully. "It doesn't say what rule I broke. Could you clarify?" Karen's tone sharpened. "The board determined you were in violation of the governing documents. The letter is clear." "With respect," David said, forcing calm into his voice, "it's not clear. I've read the documents. I need to know which section I supposedly violated. What specifically am I being accused of?" There was a pause, then the faint sound of papers shuffling. "I'll have to check with the board," she said curtly. "You should just correct the issue to avoid further penalties." "But what issue?" David pressed. "You can't expect me to fix something if you won't tell me what it is." Karen's voice cooled even further. "The board has spoken. If you'd like to dispute it, you may attend the next HOA meeting." The line went dead a moment later, leaving David staring at the phone in disbelief. That evening, he relayed the conversation to his wife. She crossed her arms, frustration flickering in her eyes. "This is ridiculous. They can't just hand out punishments without proof. Imagine if the government worked like that. You broke a law, but we won't tell you which one." David nodded, his stomach churning. It wasn't just the unfairness of the situation. It was the helplessness. The board seemed to operate like a closed circle, unquestioned, unchallenged. Ordinary homeowners like him were expected to comply without resistance. But he couldn't shake the thought. What if he gave in now, paid the fine, and set a precedent? What if this happened again, or worse, to someone else? The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. David circled the date on the calendar, though the thought of standing before the board filled him with dread. Still, he resolved to go. He needed answers. In the days leading up to it, he couldn't help but notice how different the neighborhood felt. Every glance from a neighbor seemed suspicious, as if they knew something he didn't. He overheard snippets of conversation, on walk something about keeping up appearances and rules for a reason, and wondered if he was the subject. The place that had once felt like a sanctuary now pulsed with tension. When the evening of the meeting arrived, David dressed neatly, buttoning a shirt he usually saved for work presentations. His wife squeezed his hand before he left. "Remember," she whispered, "you're not doing anything wrong by asking questions." The HOA meeting was held in the clubhouse, a low brick building at the edge of the subdivision. Folding chairs were set up in rows, and a long table at the front held the board members. The president, a stern-looking man named Richard; the vice president, an older woman with silver hair and sharp glasses, and three others whose names David only vaguely remembered. When it was his turn to speak, he rose, holding the violation letter in his hand. His voice trembled at first, but steadied as he went on. "I received this notice," he began, "and it doesn't specify what I did wrong. I've reviewed the governing documents, but I can't find anything that explains why I'm being fined. Could the board please provide clarification what rule I supposedly violated and what evidence you have?" For a moment, silence filled the room. Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Mr. Miller, the board has determined that a violation occurred. We wouldn't have issued the notice otherwise." David tightened his grip on the paper. "With respect, that's not an answer. You're asking me to accept guilt without showing me proof. Which section of the bylaws did I break? What is the evidence?" The silver-haired vice president spoke up, her voice clipped. "We don't owe you detailed explanations. The board's judgment is final." Gasps rippled through the room from the few homeowners attending. David's pulse quickened. "You absolutely do owe me an explanation," he said firmly. "You have a fiduciary duty to the community. Issuing fines without evidence isn't just unfair, it's potentially illegal." Richard's face hardened. "If you'd like to contest this further, you may pursue arbitration, as outlined in the bylaws, but continuing to argue here will not change the board's decision." A hush fell over the room. David realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. The board was asserting power, confident that no one would challenge them. He left the meeting that night feeling both enraged and strangely resolute. The shock of the violation had given way to something deeper, a determination not to let this go unanswered. The HOA thought he would back down. They thought he would accept their word as law, but David was done being bewildered. The fight was about to begin. The morning after the meeting, David sat at his desk, staring at the violation notice. Again, the board's cold refusal to provide evidence echoed in his mind. For years, he had believed Willow Creek was a place of order and fairness, but now it felt like he was living under an arbitrary rulebook that no one else was allowed to read. Pulled the thick binder of governing documents closer and began reading again. Page after page of declarations, covenants, and bylaws blurred together, each paragraph wrapped in dense legal language. Still, David forced himself to press on. If the board insisted he had violated something, he would comb through every rule until he understood what they thought he had done. Hours slipped by. By the time he stopped, the afternoon light was fading. His head throbbed, But one thing had become clear. The board was either mistaken or deliberately withholding information. He hadn't found a single section that could reasonably explain the violation. That night, over dinner, he told his wife his conclusion. They can't prove it. That's why they won't show me the evidence, because it doesn't exist. She set down her fork and nodded slowly. Then you have to fight this. Not just for us, but for everyone in this neighborhood. If they get away with this, what's to stop them from targeting anyone they want? Her words lit a spark inside him. For the first time since the letter had arrived, David didn't feel powerless. He felt a sense of duty, not just to himself, but to the entire community. The next morning, he drafted a formal letter to the HOA. His words were polite, but firm. Dear board members, I am formally requesting the following. 1. The exact section of the governing documents that you allege I violated. And 2. Evidence of the violation, including any photographs or written reports. Until such proof is provided, I will not acknowledge or pay any fine. Please be advised that issuing fines without evidence exposes the board to legal liability and constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty. He read it aloud to his wife before printing a copy. That should get their attention, she said with a hint of pride. David delivered the letter to the HOA office and kept a copy for himself. As he walked back home, a strange calm settled over him. For the first time, he was no longer on the defensive. He had drawn a line in the sand. Days passed without a response. The silence was telling. If the board truly had proof, why wouldn't they produce it immediately? Instead, neighbors whispered. A few even approached David cautiously. I heard about the meeting, one man said, as they crossed paths on the sidewalk. Good for you for standing up to them. A lot of us have gotten those notices, and no one ever fights back. Another neighbor, a young mother, lowered her voice as she confided. They fined me last year for improper landscaping. I asked for photos, but they just told me to pay. I couldn't afford to fight it. David listened, his resolve hardening. With every story, this wasn't just about him, it was a pattern of abuse, a system built on fear and silence. And he refused to play along. By the end of the week, an envelope appeared in his mailbox with the HOA seal. His pulse quickened as he tore it open. The letter was short, almost dismissive. The board has reviewed your request. Our position remains unchanged. The violation stands. Payment is expected within 14 days to avoid additional penalties. No evidence. No citations. Nothing. David felt heat rise in his chest. They weren't just ignoring him, they were daring him. The board was betting he would give up, just like so many others. But they had miscalculated. That evening, he called an attorney. The man listened carefully as David explained everything, then let out a low whistle. You're right, they don't have a case. An HOA cannot impose fines without citing the specific rule and providing proof. If they push this in arbitration or court, they'll lose on badly. I'll draft a letter on your behalf. The attorney's confidence bolstered David's own. He realized something important. Standing up for himself didn't mean shouting at meetings or trading insults. It meant demanding accountability in the way the system was supposed to work through evidence, fairness, and the rule of law. Over the next few days, with the attorney's help, David began preparing for the fight. He gathered every HOA document, every letter he'd received, and even copies of state statutes that outlined the board's fiduciary duties. He was no longer a confused homeowner trying to make sense of a vague notice. He was building a case. The board might have thought they were untouchable, but they had underestimated him. Each night, as he laid out the papers on his dining room table, David felt a shift inside himself. Fear gave way to clarity. Frustration turned into focus. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was acting with purpose. And though he didn't know it yet, his demand for proof would set off a chain reaction that would shake the HOA board too. Its core. Because once you shine a light on power misused, shadows can no longer hide. The attorney's letter went out on a Friday morning. It was formal, sharp, and carried the weight of authority that David's own words, however determined, could not match. It demanded what the HOA had failed to provide: clear evidence, proper citation of bylaws, and justification for the fine. It warned of legal consequences if the board continued to pursue unproven claims. For the first time since the violation notice arrived, David felt like the balance of power was shifting. He wasn't just one homeowner against a board anymore. He had expertise on his side. But the HOA didn't back down easily. By the following Tuesday, another letter appeared in his mailbox. This one was longer, dripping with formality and defensiveness. The board accused him of being uncooperative, insisting their authority gave them discretion to issue fines without burdening the board with unnecessary documentation. They claimed he was wasting resources by involving legal counsel and threatened that if he pursued the matter further, all legal costs would be his responsibility. David read the letter twice, incredulous. His wife, standing beside him, shook her head. They sound desperate. They know they don't have proof. Her words made sense, but still, the letter sent a chill through him. The board wasn't just stubborn, they were doubling down. And now, the fight had moved from a simple dispute into a battle of wills. Word spread quickly. In neighborhoods like Willow Creek, gossip moved faster than any official notice. Some neighbors approached David with sympathy, telling him they admired his courage. Others looked at him with unease, as though challenging the board meant challenging the very order of the community. At a weekend barbecue, a longtime resident pulled him aside. "Be careful," she warned. "Richard the president doesn't like being challenged." A couple years back, someone else fought a violation, and suddenly their every move was under scrutiny. Mailbox height, lawn length, even their dog leash. They finally gave up and moved out. David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had already sensed Richard's stubbornness at the last meeting, but hearing this story made it clear. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. Instead of retreating, David doubled down. With his attorney's guidance, he filed an official dispute under the community's governing documents, triggering the arbitration process. The board now had no choice. They would either have to present proof of his violation or face the consequences of failing to do so. David also began documenting everything, every letter, every phone call, every casual conversation that hinted at the board's misuse of power. His dining table became a war room, covered with binders, notes, and highlighted passages of bylaws. His wife joked gently, one evening, "You look like you're preparing for a trial on national television." David smiled faintly. "In a way, I am, just a smaller stage. But if they can bully me, they can bully anyone here. That has to stop." The arbitration was set for early spring, and as the date approached, the board's hostility escalated. David began receiving additional notices, small petty accusations that his trash bin was left visible too long, or that his grass was a quarter-inch over regulation height. Each one was accompanied by veiled threats of fines. It was obvious what was happening: retaliation. Instead of scaring him into silence, however, it fueled his determination. He photographed his lawn, kept receipts from landscapers, and even asked neighbors to act as witnesses. Every attempt the board made to intimidate him only added to his growing file of evidence. The night before arbitration, David couldn't sleep. He sat at the dining table, stacks of papers spread out before him. His wife came in quietly, setting a mug of coffee beside him. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. David looked at the binder in front of him, dozens of pages of documentation neatly organized, and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be. Tomorrow, it's not just about us. It's about showing them they can't run this place like a kingdom." She squeezed his shoulder. "No matter what happens, you've already made a difference. People are watching. They're realizing they don't have to stay quiet." Her words sank deep. For weeks, David had been so focused on the mechanics of the fight, rules, letters, legal processes, that he'd nearly forgotten the bigger picture. This wasn't only about avoiding a fine, it was about dignity, fairness, and accountability. The next morning, as he walked toward the clubhouse where arbitration would take place, David felt the weight of eyes on him. Neighbors stood on porches, some nodding encouragement, others turning away. The community was divided, some loyal to the board, others secretly rooting for him. As he stepped inside, the air felt thick with tension. Richard and the other board members sat stiffly at one end of the long table, their faces hard and unyielding. At the other end, David's attorney waited, calm and prepared. This was at the moment everything had been building toward. David took a deep breath, steadying himself. The storm he had sensed weeks ago had finally arrived, and he was standing right in the middle of it. But for the first time, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel powerless. He felt ready to fight. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, as arbitration began. David sat with his attorney at one side of the long oak table, while Richard and the other board members clustered at the opposite side. Between them sat the arbitrator, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes who radiated neutrality. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Let's begin," he said. David's attorney went first, laying out the facts with precision. "My client has been accused of violating community rules, yet the board has failed to provide specifics. No bylaw cited, no photographic evidence, no witness statements, nothing. They simply issued a fine and demanded payment. That is not enforcement of standards, that is an abuse of authority." The arbitrator nodded, jotting down notes. Then he turned to the board. "Do you have documentation of the violation?" Richard, the HOA president, leaned forward with a thin smile. "Our authority allows us discretion. We don't need to waste time producing endless paperwork. When the board votes on a violation, that vote is sufficient proof." David felt heat rising in his chest, but his attorney calmly interjected, "Respectfully, that is not how fiduciary responsibility works. Authority is not the same as proof. Without evidence, fines are unenforceable. We request dismissal of all claims against my client." The arbitrator's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Richardson, do you have photographs, dated reports, or any record that Mr. Miller violated a specific bylaw?" Richard hesitated. The silver-haired vice president shuffled papers, but none of them bore relevance. A few half-hearted notes, surface scribbles about blue door, flowers, and trash bin visible, but no actual evidence. No section numbers, no timestamps, nothing concrete. The arbitrator leaned back. So you issued a fine. Without evidence, murmurs spread among the small audience of homeowners who had come to watch. David glanced at them, noticing the flicker of recognition in their eyes. This wasn't just his fight anymore, they were realizing how fragile their own security was under the board's unchecked authority. The attorney pressed the advantage. Not only is the fine baseless, but the board retaliated with additional notices once Mr. Miller requested proof. This pattern demonstrates abuse of power, not proper governance. David's heart pounded as the arbitrator raised a hand for silence. He turned toward Richard, his voice firm. You do realize that continuing such practices exposes the HOA and potentially each board member individually to liability. Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence spoke louder than words. After an hour of tense discussion, the arbitrator delivered his decision. The violation against Mr. Miller is dismissed. The board has failed to provide sufficient evidence of wrongdoing. Furthermore, the board is strongly advised to review its procedures and ensure that all future enforcement actions are supported by proper documentation. Failure to do so could result in significant legal consequences. Relief washed over David like a tidal wave. For weeks, the weight of uncertainty had pressed down on him. Now, with a few decisive sentences, that burden was lifted. HOA, seated just behind him, reached forward to squeeze his shoulder. Her eyes glistened with pride. Richard's face, however, was a mask of barely concealed anger. For the first time, he looked less like an authority figure and more like a man cornered by his own arrogance. The ruling sent ripples through Willow Creek. Within days, homeowners began sharing their own stories more openly. Violations that had long been accepted, without question, were suddenly scrutinized. People demanded proof. They attended meetings. They asked hard questions. The board, once untouchable, found itself under pressure. Richard eventually stepped down, citing personal reasons, though most suspected it was the mounting backlash. New members were elected, individuals who promised fairness, transparency, and accountability. As for David, he never sought the spotlight, but neighbors began to treat him differently. Some thanked him directly, saying his fight had given them courage. Others simply nodded respectfully when they passed him on walks, as though acknowledging what he had done for the community. One evening, weeks after the arbitration, David sat on his porch with his wife, watching the sunset over their quiet street. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful again. You know, she said softly, when that first letter came, I was scared. I thought maybe we'd made a mistake moving here. But you turned it around. You showed them they can't just bully people. David smiled faintly, sipping his tea. I didn't set out to change anything. I just wanted the truth. But maybe that's all it takes, sometimes someone willing to ask for proof. He thought back to the nights he had spent hunched over bylaws, the frustration, the doubt, the exhaustion. It had been a battle, but one worth fighting. Because in the end, it wasn't just about a fine, or a door color, or flowers along a walkway. It was about respect, about fairness, about reminding people that even small communities needed accountability. As the last light of the day faded, David realized something else too. He no longer felt like an outsider in Willow Creek. This was his home. And by standing up, he had helped make it stronger. The storm had passed. And in its wake, a new calm had taken root. One built not on blind trust, but on fairness and truth.